Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's installment of the Gilded Age Symposium. My name is Samuel Holliday, and I have the great privilege of serving as Director of Operations and Scholarship for the United States Capitol Historical Society. And we're so glad that so many of you have taken time out of your busy day to join us as we continue exploring this important chapter of American history. Before we get started with today's program and our wonderful scholars, I'd like to go over just a couple of technical housekeeping matters. One of the ways we love to use this Zoom webinar platform to engage with you, our wonderful audience, while we are limited in how we can meet in person. One of the ways we like to engage is through the question and answer session at the end of each panel discussion. That question and answer session is accessible. The question and answer section is accessible by the two speech bubbles, either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what device you're using to join us today. Now, if during the course of today's presentation you have any technical troubleshooting difficulties, you can put those into the chat section of the webinar. I will be monitoring the chat in real time. So once again, any technical matters can go into the chat. Any content questions for our wonderful speakers today can go into the Q&A section, and Jane will pose those questions at the end. And now it's also my great pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the United States Capitol Historical Society, Jane Campbell, to start today's program. Jane?
Well, thank you, Sam. We're always grateful for the work that you do behind the scenes to bring these important webinars to life. And we are so grateful for our audience for staying with us. It certainly has been a ride through this pandemic. And the one thing that has been a joy for us is that we have been able to engage scholars from around the country and have an audience from around the country. And so in many ways, our programming, while we miss the in-person touch of being close to everyone, we have had a very rich program opportunity, and that is certainly continuing today. Today, we have 3 women scholars. Let us say, women are scholars. And today that we're talking about the art and culture of the Gilded Age as we wrap up our series on the Gilded Age. We will start with Professor Nancy Unger. Professor Unger is an American history professor and author. She chairs the history department at Santa Clara University. She has written books on American women in the environmental movement, Bob La Follette and Belle La Follette. She was educated at Gonzaga University and got her PhD at the University of Southern California. She's a regular on C-SPAN, and various op-eds talking about how we can look at the past to understand present day problems. She has also, right now, her new book, which she co-edited with Oregon State University professor Christopher McKnight Nichols, is a companion to the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. So Professor Unger is going to walk us through political cartoons as a representation of the Gilded Age and how political cartoons told the story. And she will then turn the microphone over to Professor Sarah Burns. Professor Burns earned her PhD in art history at the University of Illinois, Champaign, and has been a member of the faculty at the Department of History of Art at Indiana University, Bloomington since 1979. Professor Burns is widely recognized as one of the leading and most influential scholars in the field of American art history today. Her books have been prize-winning, including Inventing the Modern Artist, Art and Culture in Gilded Age America, published by Yale University Press, where she got a special honor conferred by the National Museum of American Art in Washington, D.C. We are so honored to have Professor Burns with us to discuss painting in the Gilded Age and how that represents art and culture. And then we come home to Congress. Kathy Woodrell from the Library of Congress itself. Now, we will notice that there's been a little bit of challenge with her video. And so I will tell you, we saw her, she looks great, but you won't see her, but you'll see through her eyes, you will see pictures of the Library of Congress. And that is even more special than seeing the individual scholars. Kathy Woodrell is a reference librarian in the Humanities and Social Studies Division at the Library of Congress. She works in the grand and glorious main reading room of the Jefferson building at the Library of Congress. And there she assists researchers on a variety of research topics in art and humanities, and her specialty is the decorative arts. She received her master's in library science from Indiana University, Bloomington. So we have 2 Indiana scholars with us. And so that's our panel. We will hear from each member of the panel. As you come up with questions, put them in the Q&A. We are going to hold questions until all 3 scholars talk, and I will manage the Q&A. So if you put them in the Q&A and say, I particularly want Professor Unger, Professor Burns, Ms. Woodrell, that's fine. We'll take care of it. And so let us start. You didn't come to hear me. You came to hear our distinguished scholars. Professor Unger, tell us about political cartoons.
Thank you for that nice introduction. Let me share my screen. So, Jane, give me a nod. Do you see my screen?
Yes, I do.
Okay, we're great. Excellent. All right. Well, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. My thanks to Sam Holliday for inviting me, for making me feel so welcome, and helping me with the technical aspects of this presentation. As we are well into the 2nd year of the COVID pandemic, I thought I'd start off with this cartoon touting the benefits of the then new emphasis on public health, just to give you something to look at as I get started. When invited to speak on some aspect of Gilded Age art and culture, I knew that I couldn't possibly compete with the mastery of Sarah Burns on painting or Kathy Woodrell on architecture. But then I figured, well, who doesn't like a good cartoon? One of the reasons I love teaching the long Gilded Age and Progressive era is because there are so many wonderful cartoons that convey complex ideas succinctly or relatively simple ideas very dramatically. So let's begin with how these cartoons differed from those of the previous era. Here's one from 1861, beautifully drawn by Currier and Ives, with lots of great text that's far too much work to read. Most Gilded Age cartoons weren't nearly so demanding, and I think that's their great contribution. We don't need a lot of preachy text about the evils of child labor when this child sacrificed on the altar of profit says it all. And note the smokestacks in the background where the industry that killed her continues on uninterrupted. And this completely wordless image makes it very clear which industry is really dominating Congress. This classic cartoon is currently posted on the website of the United States Capitol Historical Society. It depicts John D. Rockefeller, who controlled 90% of the oil refining business, holding the White House and the Treasury Department in the palm of his hand as the Capitol building serves as an oil refinery. What a funny little government, he observes. And if that's too subtle for you, here are the real bosses of the Senate, these enormous money bags that represent the various trusts. Although the entrance for the monopolists on the far right is wide open, the people's entrance on the upper level has been closed. In this cartoon, the power of the trust dwarfed the Capitol, as well as Uncle Sam, law, and justice. The bag of money labeled for lobbying stuffed in his pocket shows how this is achieved. and in a view that is even more direct in its assertion of corruption at the highest levels of government. Here is the US Senate, the roost for the power trust vultures who prey on the nation, with a sign advertising seats for sale. And here, the monopoly monster with its tail wrapped around the Capitol is menacing liberty. And Uncle Sam is being asked, what are you going to do about it? Monsters with their tails wrapped around the Capitol was a popular theme. Railroads were some of the worst offenders. So here we see a brave farmer trying to beat back the monster. Congress tried as well. Here we see Uncle Sam's Wild West show. The interstate commerce commissioners are moving in on the bucking animals. Some Americans worried about the inevitable results if millionaires like Jay Gould and Cornelius Vanderbilt, shown here, resting on their bags of millions, were allowed to continue to be upheld by labor at starvation wages. Note in the right foreground, the hammer and sickle in the sea of hard times, suggesting the possibility of a revolution. I think that that concern is rendered particularly beautifully by this cartoon entitled From the Depths. Is this the risk the wealthy take by ignoring the conditions of the working class, a group that vastly outnumbers them? I love this cartoon because it so brilliantly and wordlessly captures the real potential for violent class struggle. Cartoons also revealed the various concerns about just who made up that great unwashed laboring class. Many presented the strangers flooding our shores as a serious threat to the nation's white Anglo-Saxon Protestant population. Here, with the Vatican in the background, Catholic bishops wearing mitres that turn them into crocodiles are clearly coming for the Protestant American children on the shore. Other cartoons revealed the hypocrisy of such fears. Here, wealthy American businessmen turn away a young Irish immigrant. We see, however, the shadows of their former selves when they were young immigrants. Now, some of the cartoons, the next cartoons on the vilification of immigrants are hard to look at. In the wake of the 1882 Exclusion Act, a dejected Chinese man who, despite his industry, peace, and sobriety, is the only one barred out. Note on the left, there's a sign that says, communists, socialists, and hoodlums are still welcome. Anti-Chinese activism continued. Here, San Francisco Bay features not the Statue of Liberty, welcoming earnest immigrants, but a Chinese man holding an opium pipe and radiating disease, immorality, filth, and ruin to white labor. Here we see an extremely anti-Semitic depiction of the Hebrew line, bringing a boatload of Jews in which even the fish in the sea, as seen in the bottom left, conform to negative stereotypes. And unlike the industrious Chinaman who was barred out, here we see a Jew carrying his baggage of Sabbath desecration, anarchy, disease, and poverty, able to walk right into the United States with its capital gleaming in the background, despite the obvious disapproval of Uncle Sam. A growing insistence that dangerous radicals were included among immigrant groups overrunning the country contributed to the passage of the Sedition Act in 1918. When some people wonder why, more than 150 years after the end of the Civil War, this country is still so plagued by anti-Black racism, I think some of the cartoons that actively promoted racism in the Gilded Age provide important answers. Here we see why African Americans should not be allowed to vote, as this monster is destroying the white men, leaving the white women in peril. If allowed to vote, the Negro would crush the white man. The only solution? Stand back. The honest white man will not stand it. And when African-American activist William Monroe Trotter met with Woodrow Wilson in the White House to protest Wilson's support for racial segregation, here was the result. I've been particularly struck by how, more than 100 years ago, stereotypes concerning homosexual men were so well established as to be immediately recognizable. Once war broke out in Europe, former President Theodore Roosevelt, depicted here as a warrior with his spear and his shield, demanded that the United States launch a huge military preparedness campaign. An extremely effeminate, limp-wristed Uncle Sam is saying, "Theodore, if you don't stop taunting me about unpreparedness, I'll just slap you on the wrist." And this same limp-wristed effeminacy is visible in this cartoon, drawn shortly after the war to show the impotence of the Paris Peace Conference, as the simpering police officer simply looks on as poor beleaguered Europe, about to be clubbed by Bolshevism, calls, "Officer, call a real policeman." Similar kinds of messages were used to lampoon environmentalists. Here, John Muir is shown in a dress, flowery bonnet, and apron, as he fruitlessly tries to sweep back the waters of progress that are flooding Hetch Hetchy Valley. And in 1912, the entire Republican leadership was rendered in drag, their inter-party squabbling depicted as gossipy, backbiting ladies' tea party. If you want to make men ridiculous, you present them as women. I would be remiss if I did not close with a few images of Robert La Follette, who, as you can see here, came to the Senate after transforming Wisconsin as governor, rescuing it from the railroad monster and rendering it a model state with a bow in her hair. La Follette had a big head and huge hair, so he was a cartoonist dream. He was vilified for his vote against US entry into World War I, but worked steadily in the US Senate for 19 years to remove the worst excesses of the Gilded Age. I think this cartoon is a fitting tribute, not just to his impact, but that of all the progressive reformers. And it's a good place for me to end this presentation. So I would now like to turn things over to Professor Sarah Burns, who will talk about Gilded Age painting.
Well, thank you so much. My God, those cartoons are dynamite. I love them. I could look at them and listen to you all day. So I just have to share my screen. Well, Professor Unger's introduction to the world of cartoons in the long Gilded Age sets me up really well, because actually painting for the most part is above it all. And certainly there are political implications in some works of art, but on the whole, artists had to sell, and so they had to produce saleable subjects. Let's look briefly at antebellum trends. In pre-Civil War America, the dominant modes of painting were genre painting, the painting of everyday life, and the glorification of the American wilderness. So in William Sidney Mount's Farmer's Bargaining, it's a humorous kind of anecdotal painting, which also has a little bit of a moral jab, because what are these farmers doing? Whittling, bargaining over a horse when the roof of the barn is about to collapse. Ashby Duran's painting Kindred Spirits shows the poet William Cullen Bryant and the painter Thomas Cole in the Catskills, communing with each other about the gloriousness and the distinctiveness of the American land and wilderness, the idea of nature's nation was something that was ubiquitous during this period. And then, of course, we have the Civil War, which is generally and maybe a little bit arbitrarily seen as a cultural tipping point, but certainly there are new trends and sort of different directions for painting after the Civil War. This is one of Winslow Homer's many engraving and wood engraved illustrations of the war, which were published in Harper's Weekly, for which he worked as a kind of a special artist. And I think this illustration says such a lot about the Civil War, how it transformed the sort of war making with new technology. The sharpshooter was someone who could sit up in a tree well hidden and draw a bead on the enemy. So let's look briefly at Winslow Homer. He was born in 1836 and he was largely self-taught, schooled in the arena of illustration, but he teaches himself to paint more or less. And in the early years after the war, he paints modern life and leisure, young fashionable women going to the beach. He is a very, very careful observer of light and atmosphere and weather. And the earlier works are sort of cheerful and lighthearted, but later on he gravitates towards scenes of life and death struggles in the natural world, most memorably in The Lifeline of 1884, in which an unconscious woman is being rescued from a sinking ship by a brave man who has donned this breeches buoy in order to seize her and carry her across the waves to safety. It's a very exciting and literally suspenseful representation, but ultimately Homer moves to the raw power of the sea. The idea of nature as the unconquerable force that dwarfs every kind of human achievement and lasts forever, whereas human endeavors, of course, don't. So Homer's realism it's about seeing, it's about observation. He was very, very focused on honestly representing what he saw, the surfaces of things, the light, the color, the energy. Whereas Thomas Eakins, who's a generation younger, born in 1848, he brings in a whole new kind of realism to the painting scene. He studied in Paris, he worked in Philadelphia, and he was obsessed with the structure of things, with the human body and spatial relations. He was particularly focused on understanding anatomy to the extent that he even had dissection classes for his students. He was very connected with the medical world, and you can see this in his notorious painting at the time, The Gross Clinic of 1875, in which a famous surgeon is performing an extremely gory operation on a young anesthetized patient. For many viewers at the time, this was all too real, but it testifies to Eakins' devotion to anatomy, to medical science. In the Champion Single Skulls, you have his mastery of perspective on display in these two scullers on the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia. Eakins mastered mathematically precise system of perspective. Everything had to be in perspective. All these spatial relations had to be sort of mathematically determined. So in contrast to Homer, Eakins' realism is a kind of engineering of the pictorial realm. I don't have time to touch on much on African-American artists, but I did want to bring in Henry Ossawa Tanner, who was a student of Eakins at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. And Tanner wanted to ennoble and dignify Black life, as in the banjo lesson, in which, sorry about that, in which you see an old grizzled man, possibly the grandfather of this very young boy, teaching him the banjo. And there's nothing caricatural about it, There's something, it's almost like a state of grace showing Black life in a completely different light from the cartoons that Professor Unger was showing us a few minutes ago. Tanner, however, eventually came to be discouraged by American racism, which was so prevalent at that time. So he moved to France, where he concentrated on visionary religious scenes like the Jesus and Nicodemus of 1899. And then we have cosmopolitanism. Younger painters begin to go abroad to study in Munich, study in Paris. William Merritt Chase studied in Munich in the early 1870s, and he returned to New York as a sophisticated man of the world who had an iconic studio on 10th Street in the studio building that was specially constructed for artists. And he was famous for this studio, which was crammed with treasures from his travels all around Europe, treasures from all around the world, represented in a lush and brilliant ensemble. He moves outside in the 1880s, painting luminous pictures of modern urban spaces like Central Park on the lower left. And he was famous for being just an expert seer. Most critics of the time thought there was no depth to his work at all, but that he could see so acutely and so expertly that he could even make a sand dune look interesting. Impressionism, a French import, of course, began to win popularity in the middle of the 1880s, and younger painters readily adapted it. They embraced it, and in the work of Child Haslam, for example, you see the city represented as something light and bright and safe and clean. Washington Arch was about the closest thing that New York could come to the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, but it was every bit as good, especially when it was done in this bright, cheerful style, all about color and transparency, as you can see in the Poppy Garden by Willard Metcalf, and Alden Weir's Factory Village, which shows that with Impressionism, you can even make a belching, polluting factory full of low-paid laborers look benign and in harmony with nature. Now we're going to jump across the pond and look at the famous expatriates of the time. Some American painters found success in remaining abroad. John Singer Sargent, the portrait painter, was even born in Florence, Italy, to American parents, lived in Paris and London, became a celebrity portrait painter with scintillating and dashing virtuoso style. Sargent was much in demand in the Gilded Age and later because he could make anyone look glamorous. He could make them look alive. He could even make them scandalous, as in the case of Madame X, which originally was painted with one of her diamond straps slipping off her shoulder, and it was a huge scandal in the Paris Salon. Mary Cassatt, also Philadelphia born, spent her entire life in Paris and embraced Impressionism. She was one of the very few women in the Impressionist circle. She was friends with the French Impressionist Edgar Degas. And in her early work, you can see she has an Impressionist palette. It was sort of bright, light pastels, kind of a flickering brush stroke, and paints modern women, modern young women in public and private, like these beautiful young girls at the opera. But later she turned to the theme for which she's still best known, that is mothers and babies and children. There's something very sweet and tender about the family, although I think it's kind of interesting that there's no daddy in the picture. And then we have aestheticism as really pioneered and spearheaded by the quarrelsome American expatriate James McNeill Whistler. He stands pretty much the opposite of Aikens and Winslow Homer. Basically, Whistler rather, said that nature is wrong. It's the artist who can see and create beauty out of the big chaotic mess that is nature. So he was intent on creating beautiful harmonies and decorative effects. And everything had to be an arrangement, something that the artist willed into being. Even his mother, as you can see, she's not Whistler's mother, she's arrangement in gray and black, number one. Whistler had enormous influence both in Europe and more particularly in the United States. And his work also marks sort of a trend to, like, stop looking at nature as it is and look at nature as it feels, or turning nature into decorative patterns, or in the case of painters like George Inness and Albert Pinkham Ryder, we have the complete reversal from realism to anti-realism, from what's outside to what's inside, painting visions and sensations. Inness was a Swedenborgian, a follower of Emanuel Swedenborg, an 18th century mystic, who believed that there was a spiritual realm that was exactly the mirror image of the material earthly realm, except that it was all porous and diaphanous. So Inness, in his paintings, wanted to show the parallelism between this real material world and the spiritual world. Albert Pinkham Ryder, a painter born in New Bedford, turned even further inside and painted these mysterious, dreamy, romantic images that verge on abstraction and have a kind of uncanny quality to them. Sometimes it would take years to finish these little paintings, building up layers and layers and layers. You can see how that affected the paintings over time. This rather bad cracking, but they're still compelling and almost hypnotically fascinating. But what about popular art? What did regular people like? Here's a couple of examples. J.G. Brown, who was enormously successful and commercially as well as artistically, for painting sweet, pathetic street children who seem to embody a kind of Horatio Alger quality. They're poor, but they're hardworking. They're certainly not threatening in any way, even though they come from the impoverished urban classes. So it's very reassuring art, painted in a realistic manner. Still life painters like William Harnett were also popular because their paintings were so much fun. They challenged you to realize that they weren't seeing actual objects hanging and casting shadows, but it was all an illusion. These paintings hung in places like bars and barbershops. And finally, from the low to the very high, we have the American Renaissance, which blossomed beginning in the 1890s and onward. This trend was related to the City Beautiful movement. And the goal was to adorn and enrich public spaces with high-minded allegorical representations that were meant to be didactic and uplifting, as in Elihu Vedder's Government mural of 1896, where you see this vision of ideal government in a kind of idealizing, balanced, and classical style, government of the people, by the people, for the people. And now for more interesting insights into the Library of Congress building and its art itself, I'm delighted to be able to turn over the screen to Kathy Wardell, excuse me, who will show us more. Let's see, I have to unshare. There we go.
Great. So I want to talk today about the Thomas Jefferson building at the Library of Congress, and the dream of a national library was actually realized during the Gilded Age. I'm Kathy Woodrell, reference librarian at the Library of Congress, and today I'm going to illustrate Gilded Age notions and ideals within the art and architecture of the Jefferson building. I'm I'm certain that many of you have visited the library, but I'll begin with a little bit of history. So founded in 1800, the Congressional Library was housed in the US Capitol for almost 100 years. The British burned the Capitol in 1814, destroying the library, which consisted of legal materials, maps, and documents. Thomas Jefferson's private book collection was purchased with some controversy, and it forever changed the tenor of the collections. It expanded subjects and languages exponentially. Located in the north wing of the attic in the Capitol, additional space was constantly needed to accommodate the growing collections. In the year 1870, the new copyright law brought almost 20,000 books, journals, newspapers, photographs, and other objects into the library, according to the librarian's annual report. And you can see the many stacks and bags of boxes with no place to store them in this image. Appointed by Abraham Lincoln in 1864, Ainsworth Rand Spofford pleaded for a separate library building for many, many years. Again, you can see the clutter in the library at his own desk. But in 1873, a commission was formed to supervise the location and building of a separate library building. Spofford wrote the specifications, which included a circular reading room, and 26 architects submitted plans for the building. Smith, Meyer, and Pels were selected. Unfortunately, the next year, Congress asked for additional designs. Some members had visited European libraries while on vacation, and they had new ideas. The architectural competition was reopened, and it stayed open for 12 years, during which time a number of plans in different styles were submitted by many different architects. Around this time, a small delegation asked that the circular reading room for the Library of Congress be more beautiful than that of the British Library. Now this is part of the British Museum. But in 1886, Congress approved a bill to build the library on East Capitol Street, and Smith, Meyer, and Pels prevailed again, this time with a domed reading room. These are construction photos, but in the intervening years, the United States had changed. The new era brought immigrants with new talents to our shores, and many of them were hired to sculpt, to paint, and to help build our dreams. As a culture, we had more time, more money, we had new technologies, and we had seen what our new country was actually capable of at World's Fairs, in magazines. There was an explosion of art and ideas. This is the marble carving shop at the Library of Congress. And so you can see that people are working here. When the building was proposed, the budget for the building was actually $7 million. And the building actually came in ahead of schedule and under budget. It was a government building. There was no budget for art or decoration of any kind. And so the paintings, the murals, and the grandeur in the Jefferson building were eked out of the existing budget. Artisans were paid, but it was considered an honor to work in the new Congressional Library. Over 40 artists and sculptors contributed to the building. I do like to point out that all of them were men. It was 1890s. So, and here are a few of the finished carved marble pieces awaiting installation. The building was finally opened to the public in 1897. In these marble carvings, you can see a column with its capital. You can see two putti, cherubs representing occupations. Here, the one on the left is a physician, and the one on the right is an electrician. I want to mention that the Jefferson building was the first public building with electricity, And at night, people drove their horses and carriages to see the gilded dome, the main reading room, the Library of Congress dome had actually been gilded, and it had electric lights shining on it. It must have been quite a spectacle. On the right, you see the American eagle, and on the far right, the Roman fasces. That's a symbol that's used really throughout the building. When the library moved from the Capitol, its collections were also delivered by horse and buggy. It was estimated that 800 tons of books, pamphlets, maps, magazines, and other materials were moved from the Capitol just across the street. Gilded Age industrialist Andrew Carnegie built the shelves for the stacks in the Library of Congress. They actually provide the architectural support for the building, yet another technological innovation. The library did manage to get its domed reading room in the main reading room where I actually work. The images here have very specific ideas, and these were painted by artist Edwin Blashfield. In the very center of this is looking up at the dome. So in the very center, Human Understanding is the painting in the center of the 160-foot dome. It depicts a woman lifting the veil of ignorance from her face so that she can instruct the children beside her. Note the collar all the way around her that you see around the image of Human Understanding. So Human Understanding depicts the Human Understanding is in the very top, and the collar is depicted, is called The Evolution of Civilization. It has 12 seated figures that represent countries or epochs and are named for their contributions. I like to point out the man with his head in his hands is modeled after Abraham Lincoln. You can see it says America there beside him. And the object by his leg is the newly invented electric dynamo. All elements of the main reading room are interrelated, from the desks where researchers study to the bronze statues, the amazing dome and plasterwork, stained glass windows depicting the 48 contiguous United States, and the ideal of each element is human understanding. Here are a couple of other pictures of the main reading room, just so you can get an idea of its grandeur. You can see Christopher Columbus, and here's one of the stained glass windows. Each window depicts 6 different state seals. This was, these are called the ethnographic heads, and obviously they have not been installed as yet, but this was actually an early attempt to make an ethnological science contribute to the decoration of an important building. Although we can't quite call it inclusion, there are 33 of these ethnographic heads in number, and if you walk around the Jefferson building, you'll see them crowning the keystones of the 1st-story windows. Back inside, this is a window that looks over the Capitol. It's a lovely view, and this Gilded Age sentiment is worth reading. Another major symbol in the Library of Congress is the Minerva marble mosaic by Elihu Vedder. It's a central feature, but there are also images of Minerva, also known as Athena, featured throughout the Jefferson building. You'll notice to her left is a sprite called then Nike. That's where we get the name on Nike tennis shoes from. And beside her is Minerva is holding a scroll of subjects for study and research. This gives you, the picture on the right gives you an image of the placement of the Minerva mosaic. It's just incredibly grand. There's an image of the stained glass ceiling in the Great Hall. I just want you to get an idea of the grandeur of the building. So However, when the Jefferson building was built, the country's educational curriculum was very different. Scholars studied Greek and/or Latin. Students were well versed in mythology, and we do not find that to be true to this day. The image of Melpomene in the red cloak or below her Bellerophon means nothing to most visitors or to most researchers. On the right, I've shown you a printer's mark for the publisher John Day. You'll find many more in the pendentives on the second floor, acknowledging many international publishers and our literary heritage. I'm so glad that you got to see this, this image in the last presentation. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about these because I think they're very significant for the Gilded Age. This is, again, Elihu Vedder. He did both these paintings and the Minerva mosaic in the Library of Congress. So these are prominently displayed. There are 5 lunettes prominently displayed outside the traditional entrance to the main reading room. And they are lunette paintings on government. There are 5 paintings, and each of them have the same elements. They have a central figure flanked by 2 others. And I'm sorry to say that some of them deal with the darker side of the Gilded Age. So in this one, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, you can see the central figure. It looks like a civilized society, and government leads to the next painting, good administration. And in good administration, you can take a look at this and see that this is an agricultural and a democratic society. Note the woman separating the wheat from the chaff and the youth dropping a ballot into an urn. He has books in his hand. The central figure has a scale. Her shield has a balance. She's approachable. Everything is good, and good administration leads to peace and prosperity. Note her blonde hair. I find it fascinating that she now has blonde hair, peace and prosperity, blonde hair. It's also spring, you can tell. It's spring in this area, and you can tell that it's a well-developed society. There's pottery, there's music, there's agriculture, and her laurel wreaths are clearly displayed. So these are elements of a well-developed society. But on the other hand, we're now going to bad administration. Note that the man beside the central figure is holding a book that says the law in his lap. He has bags of money. He's overturned the voting urn, and his factories are going at full tilt. The tree behind the central figure is in the fall of the year, so we're in decline. And notice that the cornucopia on either side of her chair are filled with coins. The path to get to her is not particularly well kept. And gosh, those really look like bedroom slippers. But the young woman on the left is hoping to get something to use. That's a weaving implement. The factories behind her are still. Bad administration leads to anarchy. And this, you can see in this image that the central figure is holding an incendiary torch. That's apparently documents of civilization. The youth on the right is wedging out a cornerstone. So not to mention the snakes in the central figure's hair. We have other images of Medusa in the building. Come and see them. Also note that there's a bomb in the lower area of the right side. So this is Elihu Vedder's good a government series on government, and I find them really fascinating for the Gilded Age. Here in these paintings, we see opulence at the expense of others. Unfortunately, a prevalent Gilded Age theme. One more thing I thought might be helpful is seeing this painting from the second floor of the Jefferson building called Blind Ambition. So perhaps this is yet another message for the Gilded Age. I also wanted to show you some of the mosaics on the floors and ceilings. They are quite exquisite. On the left, the names of those known in the field of medicine. On the right at the top is the only woman included in the Great Hall, and it is Sappho. I guess in the millennia, we couldn't really come up with anyone else. The smaller black and white image is from one of the floors. These are what people have been walking over for many, many years, but wanted you to see the splendor of these mosaics. And the splendor is endless. I just have a couple of images. Take a look at the bronze entrance doors. This is 4 of the 6. Take a look at the Neptune fountain, which is out in front of the Jefferson building, just beautifully carved and running much of the year. Sculpture is throughout the building. These were to represent different peoples of the world, but they're quite stereotypical for now. On the left is an Asian child. On the right, in that same image, is a European child. In the image on the right, there's a Native American child, and on the on the left, and on the right, an African child. So you can see that stereotypes abound. Here's some other images, just images of the Great Hall at the Library of Congress that I thought you would enjoy. The grandeur is second only to our incredible collections. But this is just to let you know that the new National Library for our new nation was just one of many dreams that were fulfilled in the Gilded Age. In the intervening years, the collections and the buildings have grown and are still available to inspire and encourage. The authors and the inspiration that we gather may differ, but the ideals are ever present. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Thank you.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you, we certainly are fortunate to have these 3 distinguished women join us, and we're going to do lightning round because we've got 2 quick questions, and then we're up against our 1 o'clock time, and we do promise people that we will conclude because we know people have places to go and things to do. One of our questioners noticed that it appears that there was a difference between the art that's popular to the mass audience in the Gilded Age and the art that is noticed by academics. Would you say that there's a difference there? And maybe Professor Burns, you can start with that.
Well, that's such an interesting question, and I think it's really basic to thinking about visual culture in the Gilded Age. It was much debated. Critics constantly talked about how the populace had to be taught, how to appreciate higher-minded painting, sort of beautiful things, like Whistler's work, for example, which doesn't tell stories, which is tasteful and decorative. But it seemed that the masses of people really gravitated toward more or less older fashioned paintings that told stories, that had morals that were realistic. So for example, my favorite instance of this is the 1893 World's Columbian exposition in Chicago, where in the American Fine Arts section of the building, the most overwhelmingly popular, like sort of giant hit painting, the carpet was worn out on the floor beneath it because so many people came and just they wanted to see it because they could relate to it. This was Thomas Hovenden's Breaking Home Ties, which shows a kind of very humble farm mother saying goodbye to her oldest son, who looks all of 16 with this big Adam's apple, and he's carrying a satchel, and his transportation is waiting outside the door. everyone could recognize every type. They related it to their own lives. Oh, my mother had a carpet like that. And everything was just rendered in beautiful, realistic detail. And so it was almost like a little, just sort of a segment of an ongoing drama. And people loved it. They didn't want to have any sort of truck with beautiful women in boudoirs. They wanted down-home stuff. So, and critics deplored the fact that these popular chromolithographs were so ubiquitous too. It's like cheesy color printing. So I think that's a great question, because it really, sort of makes us look around, what did people really like? And, look at the 20th century. How many people liked the Saturday Evening Post covers as opposed to Jackson Pollock? So, it kind of seeds, the cultural
gives us a
context ongoing.
perspective.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you, Professor Burns. We've got one more question, and I'm going to put two together because they're both for you, Ms. Woodrell, about the library. And one is, why is the Library of Congress dome no longer gilded? And could you tell a little bit more about how the shelves were built as a support for the building itself? And if you can do that quickly, I know that each of those could take forever, but do your best.
Thank you. I'm happy to. This may be apocryphal, but I understand at some point the gilding on the dome needed to be replaced. And when the library went to Congress to ask for funding to have the dome regilded, they were told something like that the library's dome should not be brighter than the dome on Congress, and that they could clad it in copper. And so the dome has been clad in copper. I think gilding a surface that large is expensive and time consuming, and but I haven't looked this up, so I can't speak definitively to this answer. It's the answer I've heard for years. The other question was about the shelves, I believe, the Carnegie steel shelves. And was there a specific question about those?
How did those become part of the support of the building, or were they?
Well, when you, right now, it's not possible to actually see the stacks, but if you go into the main card catalog, once we have reopened and are no longer accepting researchers by appointment, you actually are able to see the structure of the shelves. So the uprights in the shelves in all four quadrants of the stacks are connected through the different floors. And so it's one big unit separated by floors, and the floors are marble. One of the things they wanted to do when the library was built was not build with any wood. They wanted it to be safe and solid. And the shelves are cast iron and steel, and the floors between each stack area are marble. So thus far, we're safe. Thanks for your question.
And Professor Unger, you're going to get the last word. And you have written a book, or are in the process of writing a book, about a companion to the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. So we have been listening to conversation about the issues of the Gilded Age, from politics to art to economics. What would you want people to know and remember about the Gilded Age that would help us to understand our work today?
Well, I think the answer is in your question, that is exactly the value of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, that it's not just sort of this intellectually interesting period, but if we look today at the issues that we have with problems of race, immigration, racism, industrial problems, technology, good and bad, all of those things, we want to make things better. If we look at, the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, they're dealing with many of these same problems and issues. To me, it's a very practical study. Okay, what did they try in the past that worked? What kinds of reforms really made things better, and what didn't work? And what can we learn from their successes and failures? I mean, this is not really a novel idea, but I get a little impatient when people say, oh, history, I loved history, but I had to do something more practical. It's like, this is as practical as you get. I think history just has enormous practical value.
That's why we love having a historian have the last word, because we are the Capital Historical Society, and we are so grateful for these scholars. Thank you, Professor Burns, Professor Unger, Ms. Woodrell. We really appreciate, and we appreciate all of our supporters. As you know, I always have to do what we call the NPR moment. We exist because we're a nonprofit. We exist because of the support of our members and supporters. While we are the Capital Historical Society, chartered by Congress, we are not funded by Congress. We're funded by the gracious members and support. Next week, we have 2 webinars, both very interesting. As we come along to Thanksgiving, we are going to talk about the mythology and the history of the first Thanksgiving from the perspective of the Indians. So that should be quite interesting next week, Tuesday. And then we have a new book has come out called George Washington's Final Battle. And here it is on my desk, which I have to quickly read before next week. And the final battle was to establish a capital city in Washington, D.C. So both of those are available, as all of our webinars are free, open to the public. We invite you to register for that. Thank you again to each of our scholars. This is recorded. It will be available on our website, and we look forward to everyone. As we come this week to Veterans Day, take a minute to thank those who have served in the armed services and the family members of those who are serving in the armed service. Because in fact, our military do support all of us, and it is not just the military officers, but it is also the family members. Take care, be well, have a wonderful weekend, and enjoy the sunshine. Take care. Bye.